Welcome back. I think everyone had a wonderfully inspiring Purim, whether you did it like Rabbi or like Reb Zera. And this week is Parshas Vayakhel and Parshas Parshas. So I'll share something on Parshas Vayakhel. It's interesting to note that this is the only time that on an ordinary year, which is not a leap year, Vayakhel and Pekudei are separate. And the reason is quite straightforward, very simple reason. Because Simchas Torah this year was on a Friday. So Bereshis was read immediately after Simchas Torah. And Pesach is going to be Matzah Shabbos. So Parshas Tzav, which is read on Shabbos HaGadol, is going to be read one day before Pesach. So that stretches it to the maximum. So you have one more Shabbos between Simchat Torah and Pesach than you normally have. I hope people are following. Huh? Yeah, somewhere else. Not that important, but so that's why, in order to make it work, you have to separate. Normally, on a leap year, these seders Vayakhel Pekudei and Tazriya Mitzayra and Achmed Beis Kedoshim and Behar B'Chukaisai are separate. On a regular year, they're put together. So we make up for the 4 weeks that we lose out by not having an extra Adam. But this year, we have an additional challenge, and that is that because Simchas Torah was on a Friday and Pesach is on a Sunday, so we have one more Shabbos between Simchas Torah and Pesach than we normally have. So in order to make it work, we have to split Vayakhel and Pekudei. So the Vayakhel is read in 1 week and Pekudei is read in the other week, or else we would have to reach Shmini before Pesach. So that is, and interestingly enough, the word Adar, I think I mentioned it in previous Shiurim, that Adar is Aleph Dar. That the Aleph, Alufei Shalolam, the master of the world, Kadosh Baruch Hu, dwells, Aleph Dar. And the sedris that we read in the month of Adar are generally the sedris that are associated with the Asuli Migdosh v'Shachanti v'Soicham. Make for me a sanctuary, so I will dwell in their midst. It's the Aleph Dar theme. So normally it's the 4 Shabbosim of Chedesh Adar. 4 Shabbosim of Chedesh Adar are Truma, Tetzaveh, Kisisa, and Vayakhel Pekudei. This year, because Rosh Chodesh Adar was on a Shabbos, and Chavtes Adar, Erev Rosh Chodesh Nisan, is going to be on a Shabbos, so we actually have 5 Shabbos of Chodesh Adar, which is very unusual. Because we have 5 Shabbos of Chodesh Adar, we have 5 Sedres. So what are the 5 Sedres? Truma, Tetzaveh, Kisisa, Vayakhel, and Pekudei. The 5 Sedres that speak about Aleph Dar, about the Almighty dwelling amongst the Bnei Yisrael in the Mishkan. Anyway, in the beginning of this week's Sedre, it says, Vayakhel Moshe es kol adas b'nei Yisrael. Moshe gathered together, he assembled the entire community of the children of Israel. And he told them, first of all, about Shabbos. 6 days you shall work, the 7th day is Shabbos. And then, Vayemer Moshe kol adas b'nei Yisrael. Moshe continued to speak to the entire community of the Bnei Yisrael. And he told them, Zeh hadavar shetziva Hashem, this is what Hashem has commanded. Hu me'itchem truma l'Hashem. Take from amongst you a separation for Hashem. Koil nediv leiv, anyone who is generous at heart, yivieha eis trumas Hashem, should bring the separation for Hashem. So again, beginning of the pasuk is Chu me'itchem truma l'Hashem. Take from amongst you a separation for Hashem. Koil nediv leiv yivieha eis trumas Hashem. Anyone who is generous at heart, so bring the separation of Hashem. So the Kli Yakar asks, there's a contradiction here from the beginning of the pasuk to the end of the pasuk. The beginning of the pasuk implies, take from amongst you a separation from Hashem. Sounds like it's obligatory, and it's taken whether you like it or not. And the second half of the pasuk, which says, whoever is generous in heart shall bring the truma, seems to imply that it's dependent on whether you are generous at heart. generous people give, and if you're not generous, you don't have to give. It's optional. It's voluntary. So the pasuk begins by implying that it's obligatory and concludes by implying that it's optional. Seems to be a contradiction. So the Kli Yakar explains it very simply, and he says we're talking here about two different donations. There is the half shekel, which everyone was obligated to give, from which they made the adonim, the silver sockets, in which the krushim were placed. And that was a half shekel per head, no more, no less. That was obligatory. And then, whoever is generous at heart should bring it. That is referring to the other components, which everyone gave as much as they wanted. The more generous gave more, the less generous gave less. And didn't want to give, you didn't have to give any. It wasn't obligatory. It was the kol nedivlei v'yiviyeh. Everyone who was generous at heart should bring. However, the question is, if you remember, a few weeks ago we had Parshas Truma, and in Parshas Truma was a different story. In Parshas Truma it said, "Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Leimer, daber el bnei Yisrael v'yikchu li Truma." Speak to the bnei Yisrael, and they shall take for me a separation. May eis kol ish asher yidvenu libay tikchu es trumasi. From any man whose heart is generous, you shall take my separation. And this is the separation that you should take from them. So it uses 3 times the term take. And not once does it say that the ones that are generous at heart should bring it. So surely Moshe Rabbeinu didn't say anything that Hashem didn't tell him to say. So surely when Moshe Rabbeinu said in this week's Parsha, surely that was also included in Hashem's original message, although it's not recorded in Parshas Truma. And many times we find that the Torah tells us how things were. Many times we find that the Torah tells us how it was said to Moshe, and then the Torah tells us how Moshe gave it over to the Jewish people, and it's not identical word for word. Not because Moshe Chas v'Shalom said one word that didn't come from Hashem, but because the Torah doesn't record every detail, both times. So we get the picture from reading what the Torah records Hashem having said to Moshe, plus what the Torah records Moshe saying to the Jewish people, and we understand that both were said to Moshe. Because Moshe surely didn't say to the Yidden anything that Hashem didn't tell him. The Torah doesn't record it twice, or it records it only partially twice. However, in this case, it's a little difficult to answer for 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is that in Parshas Truma, the Torah goes into great detail. Every detail is mentioned. Parshas Truma doesn't mince words. Goes into the detail of details, what you should bring for the Mishkan. Goes through all the 15 components in detail. It goes through all the construction of the Mishkan, every one of the vessels, in minutest detail. So to say that the Torah is looking to make shortcuts in Parshas Truma doesn't seem to fit. And in addition to that, there must be a reason why in Parshas Truma it's implied that this is what you have to do, and in Parshas Vayakhel it's implied that it comes out of the generosity of your heart. Why here this way and here this way? There must be a reason. So to find the answer to this question, we have an old klal in this shiur that we always talk about answering a question with another question. Yeah? So we ask another question. And that is, there's another noticeable distinction between Parshas Truma and Parshas Vayakhel. And that is that in Parshas Truma it says, Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Leimer, daber el bnei Yisrael, which literally is translated, speak to the sons of Israel. The yikchu li truma, and they should take from me a separation. So although that doesn't imply that the women are excluded, the sons and not the daughters, but nevertheless the Torah does express itself in the masculine sense. Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to the sons of Israel. So even if the women are included, but it's primarily focused on the men. While in this week's Seder, it says, Vayakhel Moshe's kol adas b'nei Yisrael. Moshe assembled the entire community of b'nei Yisrael. And another one, it says Vayakhel. We have Hakel es ha'am ha'anashim v'hanashim v'hatah. Assemble the nation, the men, the women, and the children. And it's not just that when he told them about Shabbos at the beginning of the Parsha, where it says Vayakhel Moshe's kol adas b'nei Yisrael, but a few psukim later, when he begins to tell them about the Mishkan, It also says, Vayomer Moshe el kol adas b'nei Yisrael. The Torah repeats it again, that Moshe spoke to the entire community of the Bnei Yisrael, which implies that it's very specific that the Moshe spoke to the men and the women. So he wasn't told in Parshas Truma not to speak to the women, but there is no emphasis on the role of the women. And suddenly in Parshas Vayakhel, there is an emphasis on the role of the women. If we go further into Parshas Vayakhel, it says that when they actually brought the donations to the Mishkan, Vayavayu ha'anashim al hanoshim, the men came together with the women, or the way that some of Farshim explained, they came as secondary to the women. In other words, the women were the main energy in bringing all these donations to the Mishkan, and the men also came. When it came to actually building the Mishkan, the Torah specifically talks about the role of the women, that that the women who are extremely talented wove with their hands the various materials that were needed for the Yiriyas. And it says that that the very unique and special challenge of weaving the material that is made out of goat skin had to be woven on the backs of the goats, and only then shared after the weaving. And that was a very, very unique talent, which those women who are extremely unusually talented, they were the ones that were able to do that very unique. So again, there's an emphasis on the role of the women. Towards the end of the parsha, we have the necheshes, the copper which was needed for the kiyur. So it says that they made the kiyur, the wash basin and its base, from the maresh hatsoivos, from the mirrors that the women brought. And Rashi is a whole thing how Moshe was hesitant to use those mirrors, and Hashem told him, Elu chavivan alayim min hakoil, these are most precious to me, and you should use them, and they're very special. So we find again and again in this parsha an emphasis on the role of the women, which we don't find in Parshas Truma. So let's begin by considering that the building of the Mishkan, donating to the Mishkan, and the building of the Mishkan was a kapara and a tikkun, an atonement and a correction for the sin of the golden calf. As it says at the beginning of next week's Seder, Eile pkudei ha-mishkan, mishkan ha'edus. Mishkan ha'edus means a sanctuary or the tabernacle of testimony. And Rashi explains, why is it a tabernacle of testimony? What does it testify to? And Rashi says it's testimony that Hashem forgave the Jewish people for the ego. The proof is that he caused his presence to dwell in their midst. So if the Mishkan was meant to be a proof that Hashem forgave the Jewish people for making the ego, obviously the donating to the Mishkan and the building of the Mishkan was a correction for the ego. Why was it a correction for the ego? Very simple. Because the ego was made through the fact that the Jewish people gave, they unloaded themselves of all the jewelry that they had in their ears, and they gave the gold to make an ego. And now they were generously and enthusiastically donating gold and other precious materials to make a house for Hashem. So by doing so, they undid the damage that they caused through making an ego. There was a tikkun for the chet ego. Now it's self-understood that if you have two options, you can have a system where Hashem says, you must give. And everybody says, okay, we're going to listen. We're going to do what you tell us to do. We're going to do exactly what you tell us to do. Think off that, we gave. We're Makayim the Tziva. We fulfilled the instruction. Or you have another option that people gave voluntarily, enthusiastically, from the generosity of their heart. Which would be a greater correction for the sin of the ego? Obviously the second. Nobody told them to give gold for the ego. They gave voluntarily. So surely in the correction for the sin of the ego by donating and giving to the Mishkan, the main way of doing it is by giving voluntarily. Not only that, but the whole concept that the divine presence would dwell permanently in the Mishkan has to be achieved through the Jewish people from their own volition, from their own desire, giving to the Mishkan. And I'll just point out that the whole idea of the Shekhinah coming down and resting on earth we find when did the Shekhinah rest on earth? You know, Basi Lagani Acheti Kala, the whole story of the Shekhinah coming down to earth. When did that happen? So there's always two answers. One answer is by Matan Torah. Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai. What greater revelation of divinity on the earth was there than Sinai? Greatest revelation was at Sinai. Nevertheless, what does the Medrash say? When did the Shekhinah dwell? On the day the Mishkan was established. What's the difference between the presence of the Shekhinah that came down at Sinai and the presence of the Shekhinah that came down in the Mishkan? So you see a very simple thing. The presence of the Shekhinah at Sinai was very intense, to such an extent that when the Shekhinah descended upon, when the divine presence descended upon Mount Sinai, it says, "Kol hanegea bahar moisyumas." Anyone who touches the mountain at that time will die instantly, because there's such an intense presence of the Shekhinah, it will overwhelm anything. Nevertheless, when the shofar is blown, which signifies the fact that the Shekhinah has withdrawn, you could walk on the mountain like nothing happened. The same mountain, which was so intensely filled with the presence of Hashem that if anybody touched it, they dropped dead instantaneously. The same mountain, 10 minutes later, in Sheikh HaYayvel, Bahar, you can go spazieren over there like in your backyard. No Kedusha was retained. That's as far as the mountain was concerned. As far as the Jewish people were concerned, we all know that as intense as that experience was, Parshas, right? Their souls expired by the revelation of Sinai. It was the most incredible experience that any human being ever experienced. 40 days later, they made a golden calf. Something is a bit strange over here, right? And by the Mishkan, however, when the Jewish people donated to the Mishkan, and they built the Mishkan, the Asuli Migdash, then the V'shachanti V'saycham, I will dwell in their midst, was a permanent one. Because when something is imposed from above, it only lasts as long as the imposition lasts. So as soon as the imposition is withdrawn, goodbye travel. But when it's coming from within, the Asuli Migdash, that we down here invite the presence of Hashem, then it has a much more permanent and real, lasting effect. So the Asuli Mikdash, the fact that the Jewish people donated to the Mishkan and they built the Mishkan and they invited Hashem's presence to be amongst them, caused the Hashras Hashchina, caused the presence of the divine presence to manifest itself in a permanent. Now, considering this, it's obvious that if the Mishkan would have been built purely by Hashem's instruction, Hashem says, give gold, give silver, give copper, give copper. It would not have been as effective because that would also be still a continuation of the divine imposition. As opposed to everyone who is generous at heart should voluntarily bring donations to the Mishkan. It's coming from within. That's much more effective in making the Shekhinah dwell. Makes sense, no? So, at this point, let's take it a step further. Ish v'isha, man and woman, represent giver and recipient, from above to below, from below to above. So that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Yisrael, the Almighty and the nation of Israel, called Chasna and Kal. So when it comes from above, at Bahar Sinai, that's one type of situation. When it comes from within, if the Jewish people enthusiastically, voluntarily stretch themselves to invite the Shekhinah's presence, that's coming from below, right? That's a different kind of. So basically, you have. I'll give you another illustration of this. Pasuk says, "Shma b'ni musar avicha, ve'al titesh teras imech." And listen to the instructions of your father, and don't forsake the teachings of your mother. What's the difference between Musar Avicha and Teras Imecha? So our sages tell us that Musar Avicha is Teras B'Ksav, the written law, and Teras Imecha is Teras Shebal Peh. Why? Because the written law came from above, right? The Torah is dictated word for word. We can't influence that in any way. We can't try to improve it. We can't try to detract from it. But it is. What's given from above, it's the way it is. Torah Shabbat Peh, on the other hand, is the contribution, is developed through the contribution of the Jewish people. You open up a Gemara, Beis Shammai says like this, Beis Hillel says like this, Abaye suggested this, Rabbi suggested this, Rabbi, Rabbi Yosef, Rabashi, Ravina. So it's coming from within. So Torah Shabbat Peh is called the teachings of your mother, as opposed to Torah Shabbat Ksav, which is called Musar Abicha. So that which comes from above is called the masculine Torah, and that which comes from below is called the feminine Torah. If that's the case, you could go a step further. You could say that essentially there's two kinds of Yiddishkeit. There's masculine Yiddishkeit and there's feminine Yiddishkeit, which means there's a Yiddishkeit where the focus is on Hashem gives the instructions, and we tick off, yeah, we did this right, we did this right, we did this right, yeah. That's masculine Yiddishkeit. And then there's feminine Yiddishkeit is when it's coming from within. Interestingly enough, men are obligated in more mitzvahs than women are. So the relationship of men to Hashem is, you tell me what to do, I'll do it. While by women there's less mitzvahs, but the main avodah is that many of the mitzvahs that men are obligated to keep and women are not, is because women don't need it. The mitzvahs that are Isis, for example, mitfilm, tzitzis, to remember. So women don't need it to be reminded. They are naturally have more Yiras Shamayim and more Avos Hashem and more awareness, and they're with the program essentially. I once heard, I can't confirm this to be a valid explanation, but I once heard a beautiful bar. I think it's worth its weight in gold, and I'll repeat it, although I don't know how authentic it is. There's a custom that some women have to make the bracha she'asani kirtzayim. Now, what does she'asani kirtzayim mean? Literally, it means that you've made me according to your will. So I once heard somebody explain it the following way. He said, a man cannot say she'asani kirtzayim because Hashem didn't make men in such a manner that they should be naturally adjusted and to His will. A man can't say Hashem created me with a natural instinct to put on tefillin. Hashem created me with a natural instinct to wear tzitzis, a natural instinct to blow shofar, a natural instinct to build a sukkah, a natural instinct to have lulav and esrog. If Hashem told me I have to, I go ahead and I do it. While women, Hashem created women kirtzayna, that they should be naturally suited to Hashem's will. The role of the major role of a woman, which is to be an akeres habayis, and to establish a home and a family and give and create an atmosphere where there's an enthusiasm for Abba, create a mikdash for their Kadosh Baruch Hu in their home. This is embedded in the nature of women to be caregivers, to have that character of love and developing and dedicating in the way that is suitable for an akeres habayis. So Kadosh Baruch Hu created the women with the natural tendencies that are suited for doing what Hashem wants. And you find this in an extreme manner when it comes to the first mitzvah in the Torah. The first mitzvah in the Torah is pru urvu, be fruitful and multiply. Halachically speaking, who is obligated to keep the mitzvah of pru urvu? Only men. Women don't have the mitzvah of pru urvu. Now it's very strange, because when it comes to tefillin, you can say it's not her thing. It's not her thing. She doesn't have to put on tefillin. Men have to put on tefillin. Women, it's not their thing. They have other things. They have much more important things to deal with. But when it comes to pru urvu, you can't say it's not her thing. First of all, no one can fulfill the mitzvah of pru urvu without the women. And second of all, a woman's got akeres habayis. This is her main shlichus to establish a family, a home. So the answer is men are obligated to keep the mitzvah of pru urvu, because if they weren't obligated, perhaps they wouldn't fulfill it. While women, it's within their nature they understand that if my role is to be an akeres habayis, then obviously I have to go ahead and establish a family and do it in the best way possible. It doesn't have to be a mitzvah. So again, coming back to what we said before about masculine Judaism and feminine Judaism, masculine Judaism is imposed from above. Do this, do this, do that. Yeah, take off all the boxes, you've done it. Feminine Judaism is when it comes from within. So although every Jew man and woman, has to engage in both those roles. But primarily, masculine Judaism is the man's thing, and feminine Judaism is primarily the woman's thing. So let me just tie up the whole thing together, and then I'll take questions. Yeah. So you have Parshas Truma, and you have Parshas Vayakhel. What's Parshas Truma? Parshas Truma is Hashem told Moshe, tell the Jewish people, I instruct them to build a Mishkan. So over there, the women aren't mentioned, even though they're included. But the focus is not on the women. This is not a feminine experience. This is a masculine experience. Hashem told Moshe, tell the Jewish people, I instruct them to build a Mishkan. But Vayakhel is Moshe assembles the Jewish people and tells them, there's an opportunity here. Whoever is generous in heart should bring the separation for Hashem. And we're going for it. So that is something over there, the women play a very important role. Because to give of yourself voluntarily, enthusiastically, not just because you've been instructed to, not just because you have to, not because you want to, because you realize that this is an incredible opportunity. What a privilege it is to build a home for Hashem. So here, there's a special emphasis on the role of the women. And the women stood out in their involvement. They used their most incredible talents. They brought gifts with greater enthusiasm than the men did. The greatest talents were expressed from the women. And look at the story with the Maris Hatzevos. What does it say about the Maris Hatzevos? That Moshe Rabbeinu was hesitant to accept them because he said that the mirrors were made, they're not used for such holy purposes. And Hashem said, no, just the opposite. Why is it Chavim and Alayim Arakel? Because the Jewish women in Mitzrayim, under the most difficult times, used these mirrors to establish Jewish families. To prepare a generation that's going to be able to go to Har Sinai and receive the Torah, a generation that's going to cross the Yam Suf and says Zek Liba and Vehu. That only was facilitated through the devotion and dedication of the Jewish women who used these mirrors to establish the future of the Jewish people. Nobody told them they had to, but it came from within them. And the same thing when it came to giving to the Mishkan, they gave from within. And because they gave from within, it's so precious to Hashem. And that's what makes it a proper tikkun for the Chet HaEgel, the fact that it came voluntarily and enthusiastically from the Jewish people. That's what makes the Shekhinah dwell permanently. It's not an imposition from above that comes and lasts as long as it lasts. It's something that comes from within. When it comes from within, it's lasting. It's real. So that explains why, although surely Moshe was told by Hashem that the Jewish people should give out of the generosity of their heart, but it's the place to talk about it, the place to emphasize it is not at the beginning of Parshas Truma, where the emphasis is on Hashem instructing about the building of the Mishkan, but rather the place to focus on this is in Vayakhel, where it talks about the Jewish people being assembled to give of themselves to make a Mishkan. Is that clear? I'm sorry, we have a question that's waiting over here, and I asked the lady to please wait until we complete the point. Okay?
Okay, before we start in the morning, when did the real Shem stand with the man says, thank you for making...
Shaloi Asani Isha. Yeah.
The man is saying, thank you for the life.
Mitzvahs, right.
When does it become detrimental or insulting to women?
It never was meant to be insulting to women. There's a lot of ignorance out there. I think that the way we just put it forth, there's nothing here insulting to women at all. So we have to combat the ignorance that's out there. And I'll tell you, anyone who was exposed to the Rebbe's teachings cannot figure out the life of them how anybody would think that Yiddishkeit considers women to be second fiddle. Because the Rebbe spoke about the role of women with such respect and with such enthusiasm that It's the most amazing thing. And Chazal say that Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, the Imais were superior to the others in prophecy. Hashem told Avraham, Kol asher temer elecha Sarah shma b'koilo, whatever Sarah tells you, you should listen to. The Kohen Gadol in the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash had to be a man, right?
He was actually married.
True, a very good point. But the Kohen Gadol in every Jewish home, which is a real sanctuary, is a woman. Akeres Habayis, right? So the question is, and this also is one of the sources of the whole confusion. In Christianity, the place to serve, the place to worship, is the house of worship. The home has nothing to do with God. It's a distraction. In Yiddishkeit, we only go to shul to inspire ourselves to serve Hashem at home the way we're meant to serve Him at home, right? But the main focus is at home. So all the whole misunderstanding that women's role is secondary because they sit behind the mechitza in shul is all coming from a misconception that the place of worship is the shul. The shul is only a facilitator to bring and to give you an opportunity to get inspired to worship better when you get home. And in the home, as I said before, the Kohen Gadol was the woman.
The answer is that it's equal, but
It's not only equal. I think the Torah gives the women an incredible place of respect that is far beyond that of a man. But there's pluses and minuses to every situation. So the bracha Shloyasani Isha is thanking Hashem for the mitzvahs that men were given, which are mitzvahs at the end of the day an opportunity to connect to Hashem in an incredible way. So every mitzvah that a person receives, he has to thank Hashem for.
why is it that the Babbage don't say that
Well, I don't know if it's a rule that the Babbage don't say or do say, but one thing is that the Alter Rebbe didn't put it in the Siddur. Why he didn't put it in the Siddur, I don't know. Some say he didn't put it in the Siddur because it doesn't say in the Gemara, and the Alter Rebbe did not hold of making up brachas that are not written in the Gemara. Some say that he just didn't put it in the Siddur because the Siddur was written l'chatchila for just like generally the Siddur is written in the masculine form, so it didn't put it in. But anyway, whatever minhag people have is all Kodesh Kadashim, all Jewish customs are holy. And I don't think it's not one of the 10 mitzvah campaigns to encourage people to say Shasana Kirtzayne, nor to discourage people to say Shasana Kirtzayne. Everyone can do exactly what their minhag is. Yes.
So why is everything
Why is that written in a positive way? Okay, so with Pashtus, it's a combination. There's 3 brachas that Chazal set out, thanking Hashem for the additional mitzvahs that we have. So a Gentile has 7 mitzvahs, right? As opposed to 613. So if you want to thank Hashem for the mitzvahs, the first thing is that we're Yidden and not Goyim, right? That's the first thing. Then there is an Eved Kanani, a Canaanite servant, has certain mitzvahs, many more than 7, but he doesn't have, there are many mitzvahs that he doesn't have. So that's the next bracha Shalei Asani Eved. And then a woman is obviously on an infinitely higher madrega than an Eved, but still there are certain mitzvahs that she's potter from. So if you want to thank Hashem for the mitzvahs that you're chayiv in, the next mitzvah, bracha Shalei Asani Isha. It could have been written different. I'm sure Chazal have many, many reasons on every level why they wrote it like this and not like that. I don't know what the gematria of each word is and what energies in Kabbalah each word accesses. I don't know. Yes, sorry. Yes, thank you for being patient.
I was wondering about the women's. Like Riku is a part of Vayakhel. Many times.
Chu me'itchem truma l'Hashem. Kol nediv leiv yivieha es trumas Hashem. The beginning of the pasuk says, "Chu me'itchem truma l'Hashem." Take from amongst you a separation for Hashem. Whoever is generous in heart shall bring the separation for Hashem. That's in Vayakhel. In Truma it says, "Daber el bnei Yisrael v'yikchu li truma." Speak to the bnei Yisrael; they shall take from me truma. That's v'yikchu once. From every man whose heart will be generous, tikchu as through masa, you shall take my separation. And this is the separation that you should take from amongst them. So 3 times it says to take. Not once does it say to bring. And in Parshas Vayakhel, it says 1 time, take from amongst you a truma to Hashem. And right away it says, anyone who's generous in heart, shall bring the truma. So there's an emphasis here on people bringing out of their own generosity rather than being told they have to give. Take. That's the point that we started this discussion. Okay, that's clear enough? Okay. Okay, we're going to move on to Tanya, unless there's any other questions on what we spoke about earlier. Okay, so in Tanya, we're still in the middle of the first chapter, but we turned over the page. So we are on page 10 is the number on top of the page, and 4, if you have a bilingual Tanya, is the number on the bottom of the page. And we're up to the first note. You'll notice on the left side of the page, there's a Haggadah, a note. So alongside the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe wrote on the side of the margins, he wrote certain notes. This is a note that the Alter Rebbe wrote on the margin of the Tanya. So we were discussing in last week's Shiur that a Beinani is someone who is 100% perfect in the fulfillment of mitzvahs and 100% perfect in being careful not to transgress any Aveda in the 3 areas of Machshava, Dibur, and Maisa. So when it comes to thought, speech, and deed, the Beinani is absolutely perfect. So why is he called a Beinani? We said because our mission in this world consists of 2. There's generally speaking 2 things that we have in our mission in this world. One is to do the right thing, including not doing the wrong thing. And the other is to be the right thing. To be the right thing is not measured by what we do. But to be the right thing is measured by our enthusiasm, by our excitement, by our desires, what our priorities are, what are we tempted. That defines who we are. So it's not sufficient to just do the right thing. We also have to work on ourselves internally. As the pasuk says, you should exterminate evil from within yourself, not just from your actions and from your speech and from your thought. So if a person is 100% on the right page when it comes to doing the right thing and not doing the wrong thing, but he still has his desires and his enthusiasm and his set of priorities and his temptations are not in sync with Ein Oid Milvado. He has other things that are important to him or that excite him or that attract him other than godliness. So he has a lot to work on improving the who he is, although he's 100% in order as far as doing the right thing is concerned. So therefore, he's got 50% success. He succeeded in the 50% of doing the right thing and not doing the wrong thing. But he still has a far way to go when it comes to becoming the right thing, being the right thing. And therefore, we call him a Beinani. It's halfway there. So a Rasha would be someone who transgresses. Chas v'shalom. Hashem tells him, don't do this, and he turns around to Hashem and he says, I'll do what I want. Right? So if that happens even one time, he's completely rejecting Hashem's authority. Or Hashem says, do this, and he says, as they say in this country, I can't be bothered. Yeah? So then he's not accepting El Malchus Shamayim, as Mr. Tuffman pointed out the other week, that Shema is the famous El Malchus Shamayim. Doesn't accept the yoke of the heavenly kingship. That's a Rasha. But if a person accepts the yoke of the heavenly kingship, whatever Hashem says to do, I'm obviously going to do. Whatever Hashem says not to do, I'm obviously not going to do. And that encompasses my machshava, my dibur, and my mind, so my thoughts, my speech, and my deed. However, internally, I still have an excitement and an enthusiasm and a value I give to other things other than godliness. So I have a long way to go on working on myself internally. So therefore, such a person is called a Beinani, as opposed to a tzaddik who not only is doing the right thing, but he's also on the right page emotionally. The only thing that he considers to be important and valuable and desirable and something that he's passionate about is connecting to Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs. Anything other than that is no interest whatsoever. Because he's fulfilled the bi'arta hara mikir becha, he's exterminated evil from within himself, not just from his actions.
Can a Beinani become a tzaddik?
Sure, if he has, well, not every Beinani, but in principle, a person can be a Beinani and then work his way up to a tzaddik. Question is, in order to become a true tzaddik, one needs to have tremendous yata d'shmai. It's a gift from heaven. Yeah, you have to have the type of neshama which is able to really achieve that. Not everyone. We learned Barasa Tzadikim, that Eve said Barasa Tzadikim, which later the Alter Rebbe is going to explain, means you created certain people with the ability to be able to reach the level of tzaddik, and certain people don't necessarily have that ability because they have another mission in life. Their mission is to continuously fight against the Yetzer Hara. So they're stuck with the Yetzer Hara, and they have the privilege of continuously generating a massive positive divine energy in the world through their battle with the Yetzer Hara. Right? So, but nevertheless, everyone has the oath. Do the maximum you can to work on yourself to try and move in the direction of being a tzaddik, and everyone can fulfill it in some minimal way. We can all improve in our priorities and our desires. We can always go a step above where we are.
So like in Ronaldo, the way they try to touch every tiger, so they didn't become tzaddik because of that.
They didn't. Okay, so the question was about people that crush their types. So the question is, what do you mean by crushing the types? Crush their passions, their desires. So you could crush something by not doing it, by doing the opposite. That's practice, and you're trying to get into the habit, right? But it doesn't mean that you won't desire it again a day later, right? Because you haven't really changed your inner self. This is an issue which we discussed when we did the Hagdama, when we did the Sharblat of Tanya, that there's two approaches. There's the short and long way and the long and short way. So the Baal Shem Tov teaches the importance of putting an emphasis on having the right passions and the right desires. And the Alter Rebbe teaches, as we're going to learn, that through understanding the greatness of Hashem and learning about the greatness of Hashem and focusing on it and contemplating on it and the greatness of Torah and the greatness of a mitzvah, that helps influence the whole psyche of the person, that his priorities should be different. And that's a whole discussion for itself. But right now, let's focus on the fact that at the end of last week's Shiur, we learned about the Beinani, and we clarified that a Beinani is a person who never sins. Never sins, in the sense, never breaks the halacha, doing the wrong thing, and never omits doing the right thing. Yes?
What is below a Beinani?
A Rasha. Is Rasha v'toiv loy? What is below a Beinani, the question was. The answer is a Rasha. A Rasha v'toiv loy is the higher level of Rasha, and a Rasha v'ra is the lower level of Rasha, which in later chapters we're going to learn exactly the difference. But the point is that if a person turns around to Hashem, as I said before, and he says, don't tell me what to do. I'm going to hold the shots of my life. You're not in charge. Right? So it means you're rejecting Hashem's authority. Someone who rejects Hashem's authority is a Rasha. I just want to make sure that's clear. Yeah? Yes?
It's not that simple.
Not that simple.
When you do something, not saying Hashem, I reject you, you're just doing it. It's not.
But the fact that you're just doing it and not considering the fact that Hashem is standing right next to you and telling you don't do it is also a rejection of Hashem's authority. Yeah, it's not with the same. It was not with the salt and pepper that I described it. Okay, so now the Alter Rebbe in the note is asking on this. He's questioning this, and he asks it from the following perspective. There's a story in the Zohar that Rav Hamnuna had an interaction with Eliyahu Hanavi. And Rav Hamnuna asked Eliyahu Hanavi about the concept of tzaddik v'ra'aloi. Now, tzaddik v'ra'aloi literally, as the Gemara discusses, tzaddik v'ra'aloi means a tzaddik who suffers. Right? Rav Hamnuna wanted to understand, why is there such a concept as a tzaddik who suffers? After all, the Torah says, you do the right thing, everything's going to be good. Yeah? So why is it such a concept of tzaddik who suffers? Rav Hamnuna asked this question to Eliyahu, and he said, I have a suggestion. Maybe I'll tell you what it is. Maybe a tzaddik v'ra'aloi is a tzaddik who has a few avedas. And because he has only a few Avedas, Hashem wants to punish him in this world, to cleanse him from his Avedas, so that in the world to come, and give him all full reward. Because Hashem loves a tzaddik. We discussed this already in one of the earlier shiurim. Hashem loves a tzaddik. He wants to give him the best deal. And the world to come is so much greater than this world. So instead of giving him a good life in this world, and then he has outstanding debts to pay up in the world to come, he gives him a bit of a rough ride in this world, so that in the world to come, which is the Yom Shekulei Toiv and Yom Shekulei Aruch, the world which is all good and all long and everything is wonderful, over there he'll be able to get 100% his full due. That's what Rav Hamnuna suggested to Eliyahu Hanavi. Perhaps that's the reason why there's such a thing as a tzaddik v'rama. So the Zohar says, Eliyahu Hanavi said to him, no, that's not what it is. What it is that the tzaddik suffers for the sin of the generation. So there could be other people in the generation that have done things that they shouldn't have done. And the tzaddik, being that he is a shabaklolis, he has a responsibility, he has a manig, so he suffers for the sin of the generation. So it's not because he is imperfect in his own avodas Hashem, but because of the sin of the generation. That's the conversation in the Zohar between Rav Hamnuna and Eliyahu Hanavi. So the Alter Rebbe asks a simple question. We have just established that a Beinoni is someone who doesn't have any sins. Now, if a Beinoni doesn't have any sins, surely a tzaddik doesn't have any sins. So how does Rav Hamnuna say to Eliyahu Hanavi, perhaps the reason why a tzaddik suffers is because he has only a few sins? If he has only a few sins, he's not a tzaddik, he's not even a Beinoni. Yeah, that's the question. So let's learn it inside. Hago. What about what it says in the Zohar, in the third section of Zohar, page 231? That the reason why a tzaddik suffers is because he has only a few sins. So how does that fit with what we just established, that a Beinoni has no sins at all? Says the Alter Rebbe, I want to remind you, he shaylas Rav Hamnuna Eliyahu. That was the question that Rav Hamnuna posed to Eliyahu. Rav Hamnuna suggested to Eliyahu, perhaps the reason why a tzaddik suffers is because he has a few sins. But Eliyahu did not accept that. But according to the answer that Eliyahu Hanavi gave, as I just explained, that the answer, it doesn't quote it over here, but the answer that Eliyahu said over there in the Zohar is that he suffers because of the sin of the generation. So Pirush tzaddik v'ralei u'kameshakasa b'nai mehem pash mishpat d'leil. So the meaning of tzaddik v'ralei is, as we quoted before from Rai Mehemna, Pasha Mishpatim, that tzaddik v'ralei means a tzaddik that has a little bit of evil within him, but it's loy, it's totally subservient to his essence, which is good. As the Alter Rebbe is going to explain that in greater detail when we come to Perek Yud, when we talk about the different levels of tzaddik. But it means that in his inner self, there is still a little bit of evil. Hasn't completely eradicated the evil as a tzaddik b'toiv loy has. And that little bit of evil that exists still within himself is completely subordinated and subservient to the good. That's
explanation why it's that. That is it. I don't mean he suffers physically or spiritually or
the simple meaning is physically. But can it have other connotations? Probably can. Now you're still left with the question. Okay, so in conclusion, a tzaddik v'ralei doesn't have any sins. Because Eliyahu Hanavi answered him, that's not because he has a few sins, but because of the sin of the generation. However, the fact that Rav Hamnuna, who was a great scholar, even made that suggestion, isn't that a problem for when we establish that it's clear that a Beinoni never sins and never will sin? But didn't we say just that Rav Hamnuna suggested to Eliyahu that perhaps the reason why a tzaddik suffers is because of a few sins? How does that work? So it wasn't the conclusion, but it was a suggestion. So the Alter Rebbe concludes with the words, "V'shivim panim la'Torah." We know that everything in the Torah has 70 interpretations. So Rav Hamnuna thought that perhaps one of the 70 interpretations would allow you to interpret tzaddik. A tzaddik v'ralei is a tzaddik that has only a few sins. But according to Eliyahu Hanavi's answer, we don't even have to consider it as one of the 70 interpretations. It's page 10 on the top of the page and page 4 on the bottom, number 4 on the bottom of the page. Okay, so we're going to move on back to the text of the Tanya. We're on the fifth line from the top of the page. Okay. Now the Alter Rebbe is again going to challenge this statement that we made last week, that a Beinoni has no sins at all, and he's going to challenge it from various sources, because to everybody it sounds like Beinoni has no sins at all. Isn't the Beinoni the one in the middle? Yeah. And where do we get this impression from? We get this impression from Mamar Chazal. So the Alter Rebbe says, what about what we say in general, that if someone is 50-50, he's called a Beinoni? And if he has a majority of merits, he's called a tzaddik. And where do we find this? We find this both. We just had it in the Rambam, Milchas Tshuva now. We're learning Rambam, Milchas Tshuva. And we have that in Rosh Hashanah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu judges every person. People that have a majority of merit are put into the book of the righteous. People that have a majority of demerits are put into the book of the wicked. And people that are 50-50 are given the Aseret Shemei Tshuva to get their act together. So it's clear that a Beinoni is somebody who's 50-50. And the same thing applies to the judgment that takes place after 120. After 120, people are judged by the majority of their deeds. That's the whole thing. How do you count the majority? Only Hashem knows how it's going to be counted. But at the end of the day, the majority of good deeds makes one is treated as a righteous. The majority of bad deeds, one is treated as wicked. And 50-50 is a controversial issue. But so tzaddik means majority of good. Rasha means majority of bad. And Beinoni is 50-50. So how does the Alter Rebbe suddenly over here come along and create a new definition of Beinoni? The Beinoni is 100%. Doesn't fit with what we find in Mamar Chazal. So the Alter Rebbe says, "Hu shem hamushal inyan scharvai." Alter Rebbe introduces a very interesting thing over here. We have what's called a shem hatoyar, a name that describes what something really is. And we have a Shem HaMushal as a borrowed name. What do we mean by a borrowed name? I'll give you a simple example. What's a leg? A leg is something a person stands on, walks on, moves its position to stand up and to sit down, to run, to squat. Use it for a lot of things, right? What about the leg of the table? Is a leg of a table also a leg? It can't run. It can't sit down. It can't squat. It's not made of flesh. Doesn't have any blood vessels in it. What makes it a leg? The answer is, it does something similar to what a human leg does. Just like a human being stands on his legs, a table stands on its legs. So we borrow the term leg, not suggesting that that's what a leg really is, but we borrow the term leg for the purpose of our conversation. So we take the chair has legs, the table has legs, but that's not a real leg. Similarly, says the Alter Rebbe, we have words that we use to describe situations. We're either using them as a Shem HaTayah, as a name that describes what something really is, or we're using it for the purpose of our conversation. So take, for example, like this. Two people come to Bezdin, and each one puts forth their argument. This one says, the other guy embezzled me 10,000 pounds. And he brings all the documents to prove it. And then the Dayan says to the other fellow, what's your side of the story? And he tells total opposite. It also has documents to prove his part of the story. Right? And they let them sit down and they sift through everything and they work it through and they hear the testimony and they carefully examine everything. And after a lot of deliberation, they come out and they say, Ata Zakai, Ata Chai. You are found to be meritorious in this case. You are found to be guilty in this case. Right? And therefore, you have to pay the 10,000 pounds that you have been charged as having embezzled, or you don't have to pay. Okay? So what do you say? You are meritorious. You are guilty or obligated, whatever it is. What are you saying? You're saying that we went through this person from the minute he was born till the day he dies, and we observed his whole existence, and we decided he's a good person, he's a bad person? No. We're dealing with a case over here, a monetary case. And with all connection to this monetary case, for all practical purposes, we're going to borrow the word zakai or tzaddik to describe your role in this case. And we're going to borrow the word chayev or rasha to describe your role in this case. I'm not saying that's who you are. As far as this case is concerned, That's the role that you play. Similarly, Beis Din Shel Maila, the heavenly court, also has rules by which it judges. So when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, or it comes after 120, they have to judge a person. So for the purpose of judgment, they put all his merits on the scale, all his demerits on the scale, and whichever one overweighs, that's called a tzaddik in reference to the judgment of Rosh Hashanah. That's called a Rasha in reference to the judgment of Rosh Hashanah. And that's called a Beinoni in reference to the judgment of Rosh Hashanah. But that's not what a tzaddik or a Rasha or a Beinoni really are. That's a borrowed term for the purpose of this deliberation. We use it for this purpose. You want to talk about what a tzaddik really is, what a Beinoni really is, what a Rasha really is. That's a whole different discussion. That's what we're talking about here in Tanya. So, because a person is judged according to the majority of his deeds, therefore, as far as reward and punishment is concerned, we use the borrowed term tzaddik to describe a person who has a majority of merits. And therefore, he would be called righteous in his judgment if he's found righteous in this judgment. It's not a general description of his existence. It's a practical thing with reference to this judgment. But as far as the truth of the description of that virtue, of that level, those various levels of tzaddikim and beinanim, Amru Razal, in reference to that, we already quoted before the statement of our sages, tzaddikim yetzer toiv shoiftam. The tzaddik is someone who only the yetzer toiv advises him. If the yetzer hara advises him, he's no longer a tzaddik, even if he rejects his advice. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, and this we didn't quote before, but this is from the same Gemara. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, "V'libi chalol bekirbi." David HaMelech said, "My heart is chalol within me." And the word chalol has two interpretations. It can mean chalol, can mean void, empty. So in my heart, Hashem created me with two sides to my heart. The right side of my heart is the yetzer toiv, and the left side of my heart is the yetzer hara. But if I eradicated my yetzer hara, if I fasted so much until I got rid of my yetzer hara, so there's a vacancy in my heart. So belibi chalol b'kirbi, if we translate it from the chalol, from the word chalulim, that would mean like an empty space. There's an empty space in my heart. She'ein lo yetzer hara, he has no yetzer hara, ki hargi b'tainus, because he killed it through fasting. That would be an example of a tzaddik. Or another translation to the word chalol. A chalol means a corpse, like ki yimatzeh chalol ba'adama. By egla rufa, if a corpse is found in land, Hashem has given you, and you don't know who killed him, so there's a whole process of egla rufa. So the word chalol means a corpse. So what does it mean? Belibi chalol b'kirbi. Inside my heart, there's a corpse. Because on the right side of my heart, there's a yetzer hara, yetzer toiv, and the yetzer toiv is doing very well. And the left side of my heart, there's a yetzer hara. Once was upon a time was a yetzer hara, but then he got slaughtered, and now he's a corpse. So that's a tzaddik. A tzaddik is a person who either has transformed his yetzer hara to become a yetzer toiv, like it says by Avraham Avinu, was matzasa as levavoy ne'eman lefanecha, that both parts of his heart, the two bases, both the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart, are dedicated and committed and loyal to Hashem. Or at least the level that David HaMelech is describing, where he killed his yetzer hara, and now he has only a yetzer toiv left. That would be a case of a tzaddik. But someone who hasn't reached this level of totally ridding himself of his yetzer hara, even if he has many more merits than sins, he's not on the level of a tzaddik at all. And the word "at all" emphasizes not even a beinoni. Because if he has a minority of sins, that's a rasha. And therefore, it's very clear that when it comes to describing what is a tzaddik and what is a beinoni and what is a rasha, all these gemaras that talk about how the heavenly court judges a person on Rosh Hashanah or after 120 are irrelevant to understanding the meaning of the word tzaddik, rasha, beinoni. We're not talking about the temporary usage of the word in a specific context. We're talking about the true meaning of the word. The true meaning of the word, a tzaddik is a person who is totally living an existence of kedusha. Every fiber of his being is kedusha. There's no desire, there's no temptation, there's no interest in anything which is not godly. The rasha is the person who not only has desires and temptations for things that are not godly, but he actually succumbs to those temptations and he actually follows the Yetzer Hara in practice. And the Beinoni is the person who's standing right in the middle. He has a Yetzer Hara, he has temptations, he has desires that are not godly, but he doesn't succumb to them. He says, listen, 1 minute, there's a Shulchan Aruch in this world, right? If it says a Shulchan Aruch forbidden, then we don't do it. If it says a Shulchan Aruch it's the right thing to do, we do it. So I might have an inner instinct to get angry, but I'm not going to actually cater to it. Right? Getting angry is like serving Avodah Zarah. I don't do that. I might be tempted to do that. I might be leaning towards that. I might instinctively driven that direction. But I'm a human being with free choice. I use my free choice to obey Hashem's instructions. And that's a Beinoni. Everything's clear, I hope, yeah?
Sorry, can I just ask a very different question? So a Beinoni, he makes that decision of becoming a son.
No, he makes the decision to be a Beinoni.
But you said a Beinoni can become a son.
If he works on his inner self, then he shouldn't have temptations anymore.
Or is he specific?
He can try. Whether his efforts will be successful, we can always make the decision not to listen to the Yetzer Hara. But whether we will have a Yetzer Hara or not, it's not always up to us to decide 100%. We can work on beating up the Yetzer Hara and giving the Yetzer Hara a rough ride and harassing him, but ridding ourselves of him, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And the reason why sometimes it doesn't is because sometimes it's a greater achievement to have the Yetzer Hara and not listen to him than not have one at all.
How does he know he became a son?
If he doesn't anymore have any desire for anything that's ungodly, he doesn't have to decide. It's a reality. If he's totally through and through godly, and there's no aspect of him whatsoever which is worldly anymore, anything which is ungodly means nothing to him. He actually thinks it's quite despicable. That is some of the symptoms of a tzad. And then he can get suspicious that maybe he's getting somewhere near a tzad.
So what ties into the February as well? We're talking about the Yetzer Hara and the different type of people. So you were talking about the difference between Ruma and
Vayakhel. Yeah. Okay. Wish everyone. Mrs. Han, do you want to speak to people about when the? If anybody didn't notice, Pesach is in 3 weeks. Next week we'll still have a shiur, and the week after not. Is that the? No, next week. For people on the Zoom, with the discussion over here is leaning in the direction of having next Wednesday with the last shiur before Pesach, which means that after the Chodesh Nisan, we're going to let everybody get on with the cleaning and scrubbing, and we're not going to disturb them with the shiur.